Okay, gonna test the mic, make sure that's working. Seems like it's working. So that we're getting audio. It is really blurry. I'm not sure why. It's really blurry. But let's see. Well, we're still really blurry. Not sure what's going on. Settings. Camera. Well, it may not get any better. And it's not moving, it's not following me. So, but I do want to record this because if anybody's not here, they need to hear the instructions for what you all will do on Thursday. I'm working diligently to get the grades of your last critical thinking project that you all did turned in. I have other classes that I'm grading exams for, so I apologize that I'm a little bit behind on the grading. I tried to be more prompt than that, but things just kind of happen sometimes in life. So I apologize. I'll get those done. But before you have to turn in the second critical thinking challenge, which will be on Thursday. So you're going to meet in your groups on Thursday and work on that. And it's going to involve new products, right? So new companies need to develop new products to remain competitive. And there is in the literature a suggestion that most companies need to be working on between 20 and 50 new products all the time in development. Now, when they take these kinds of averages, I think one of the things that you have to think about is that those averages reflect a lot of times major companies that are involved in developing things like, for example, drugs, right? And we have all kinds of illnesses that have come about recently. You know, in the last century, for example, we went from not knowing anything about HIV/AIDS, and it wasn't even called that at the time, to dealing with what became a global epidemic or pandemic, and having to deal with that crisis, to dealing with things like Ebola, and then, of course, most recently, the health crisis, which was SARS-CoV-19. And so when you think about companies like that, obviously, when we are exposed to new illnesses, those companies that manufacture pharmaceutical products need to develop those products fairly quickly, and they need to be coming up with products all the time, because as we are living longer and as we are exposed to more environmental hazards, the number of things that we can treat and cure obviously has become exponentially greater, right? 100 years ago, we wouldn't have been able to develop the drugs. I mean, if you think about how quickly they developed, if you contract COVID-19, how quickly they developed treatments that were effective in minimizing the symptoms of that illness, particularly among the elderly, if they could get those drugs to them quickly enough to really reduce the symptoms and the chances of having really negative health consequences as a result of exposure to COVID-19. So, as opposed to a company that is involved in sort of the manufacture of maybe one kind of product. Let's think about, and this is probably a dying industry now, the clothes hangers that you get from the laundromat or the dry cleaner, right? There's one company that probably manufactures that, and there's just not going to be a lot of innovation in their product line or a lot of diversity in their product line if they have just that one thing that they're manufacturing. Now, the problem with that is, and one of the things that we've seen, we have gone from a culture that used to take a lot of stuff to the dry cleaners and get it starched and pressed to one in which almost everything is wash and wear anymore. And that's been a huge innovation in terms of clothing technology that has allowed us to stop taking things to the dry cleaner. So I would suggest that probably that company is, whoever manufactures the wire coat hangers is probably maybe hurting because they may not have a diversified product line. So you need to constantly be coming up with new products. Now, how much you have to develop and how newness it is, well, again, it kind of depends on the business. But if you're a bigger business, you're probably going to have to be developing things fairly quickly. So what I'm going to ask you to think about in your critical thinking challenge in your groups, which you'll have Thursday to work on that, either in this room or meet online or however you want to do it, is think about Love's Travel Stop. So Love's is a major sponsor of a sales competition called the Challenger Sales Institute. And Love's has a lot of different products, not just fuel. They don't just sell fuel to cars that are going down the interstate. They have a lot of products and product lines that are sold to truckers. But one of the things that's happening, and when I went to their competition starting 2 years ago, when I went to the competition and was walking around their building, because it's hosted at the Love's Corporate Center, I noticed that they had all of these EV charging stations out at their corporate headquarters. And I said, you guys having EV charging stations at your corporate headquarters, rapid chargers, is a little bit like the chicken voting for Colonel Sanders, isn't it? Because what does Love's primarily sell, even though they have all these other product lines? They sell fuel, right? They don't, and they will tell you it's not gasoline, it's fuel. That they sell fuel. And so, like these electric cars could have a major economic impact. Well, so what I'm going to ask you to do is think about, since Love's is putting EV chargers at their corporate headquarters, and a lot of Love's are now putting them on their sites, how can they market that and make it profitable, right? What are they going to do to keep it profitable? Now, it turns out my sister-in-law has a Tesla X, which is the SUV model of the Tesla, and it's not as cheap as you would think it is to use one of those chargers. If you're not using your home charger, it costs about the same as a fill-up for a tank of gas if you go to one of the rapid charging stations. So that could be a source of revenue, right? And of course, also, what are they getting at when you're charging? Well, one of the things that may make it more profitable for Love's, as I can think about this, and I want you to think about it in the critical thinking challenge, is that the longer people stay in the store, the more they're probably going to buy, right? And EV charging, as fast as it is not as fast as filling up with a tank of gas. Tesla will tell you it is, but it's not. Now, Tesla will tell you how, like, they will give you just enough charge basically to get to the next charge. If you're going long distances in a Tesla, it will tell you, will map your route, and it will tell you how often you need to stop so that you're not spending more than about 10 or 15 minutes. But still, I can fill my car in 5 minutes or less with gas. So you're having to take time. So that's time that they're going to go inside and maybe buy more product, more Coke, more chips, more stuff that's in the Love's. So you got to keep constantly thinking about new ideas and coming up with ways to innovate. Many new products fail, even very large successful companies. Coca-Cola for many, many, many years was the #1 most valuable brand on the planet. In fact, during the Carter administration, there was something called the Coca-Cola connection among his members of his cabinet. For example, his Attorney General Bell had served on the board and been Chief General Counsel for Coca-Cola. One of his Commerce Secretary had served on the board and been a vice president at Coca-Cola. So he had like 4 or 5 of these connections that were all to Coca-Cola. And what was the first product we sent to communist China? Coca-Cola. Coca-Cola was the first product that we sent to communist China. When Richard Nixon opened up China, and then the Carter administration came along, because at the end of Nixon's, or at the beginning of Nixon's second term, he had to resign. Gerald Ford became president. And then Carter took over from that. The first product we sent was Coca-Cola. So it's amazing, sort of those kinds of corporate connections. There is a theory in elite theory that talks about that, if you're interested in that. So Coca-Cola comes up with this idea because of the Pepsi challenge, largely. In the 1980s, Pepsi did this challenge where they did blind taste tests. Now, there's been a lot of criticism of the way they went about those taste tests and the methodologies that they used, but it appeared from that kind of public opinion research that people preferred Pepsi to Coke. Now, that's true, but the challenge only involved 1 ounce. So they would give you an ounce of Coca-Cola and an ounce of Pepsi. And if people only had 1 ounce, they did seem to prefer Pepsi more. But over a 12-ounce can, they don't. Why is that? Because Pepsi is a lot sweeter than Coke. It's almost sickeningly sweet. So Coke looks at this and they come up with this idea that they're going to come up with New Coke. And New Coke was a radical failure, right? They did all this research. They spent all this time developing a product that was more like Pepsi, that was more sweet, and it was a miserable failure. People wanted the original Coke. And so they for a while, continued to market New Coke and tried it. It didn't last for very long. They had to bring back Coca-Cola, and they called it Coca-Cola Original. And now it's just back to, I think, being Coca-Cola. So new companies and new products fail. So that's one reason why you constantly need to be thinking about the market. New drugs, when they come to market, oftentimes don't work, and they are market failures, right? And they spend a lot of money. So they've got to recoup that money somehow. When we think about products and the need to develop new products, we need to talk about the way we classify products. So we can classify it as, tangible or intangible. A good is a tangible item. It's a tangible thing that you can smell, see, touch, taste, feel with your senses. Things like your clothing are tangible goods. And then we have services, which are intangible activities. Now, services marketers, and we'll talk a lot about services in another lecture, will tell you that, I'm going to move this camera manually, will tell you that all products are really services, because you don't really want the product for its own sake. What you want is you want the benefit that the product provides you. Is there anything that you can think of that you don't want? And we'll talk more about this. I'm going to turn that right there. Again, in another lecture. So think about this for next Tuesday. Is there anything that you want in and of itself? It's hard to think of anything. Why is it that I wear this jacket? Well, I like Pendleton. It's a Pendleton jacket. I like the way it looks, but more importantly, it keeps me warm, right? And when I got up this morning and came to UCO, it was chilly. By noon, I'll be sweating and have to shed the Pendleton, but I don't really want the product for its own sake. I want it for the benefit that it provides, which is the warmth and comfort of, the wool that it's made out of or whatever. So services are intangibles. Services marketers will argue that almost everything is really a service. We can also market ideas. Things that lead to other stuff. This is one of the things that I do, bless you, as an attorney. I'm marketing my ability to think critically to clients, and I'm gonna have to turn it back, and provide them with knowledge of whatever it is that they've got a problem with, whether it's that will or trust or estate that they want, so that they can pass on their worldly goods to their heirs and assigns in a more beneficial manner, avoiding taxes and things like that, or avoiding the expense of probate. So those are ideas. We can then also further classify products by kind of the way that we purchase them and what level of purchase we are talking about. Consumer products are those that are purchased by you directly. Things like, and we can break this down into convenience products, shopping products, specialty products, and unsought products. Each of these and the way you market it and the way you come up with a marketing plan for them depends on the level of product and the level of activity and sort of knowledge that it takes in order to use the product. So convenience products are exactly what they sound like. They're things that we buy quickly. They're things that are put on end caps at grocery stores. Why do they put them on end caps at grocery stores? It catches your eye, and they're impulse buys. One of the things that a lot of us do, and I have a PhD in marketing, and I know that I should not do this, and yet I do it. I know that I shouldn't go to the grocery store when I'm hungry, right? We know, and we tell you, and this is an example of how consumers are not always rational, and we talked about this idea of rational actor theory before, in that I know that study after study after study shows that if I don't want to buy more than I need at the grocery store, what I should do is I should make a list when I go to the grocery store. And I shouldn't go to the grocery store starving to death, because when you go to the grocery store starving to death and you don't make a list, everything looks good. It all looks fantastic, and you're starving. And at the last minute, when you get up to the register, you're so hungry by that point that you pick up that candy bar or that bag of chips or that pop that's in the little refrigerators that they have so conveniently located, and you get in the car and you consume it right away because you're starving, right? So those are convenience products. They're things that we don't think much about, and we don't really need a lot of knowledge in order to know how to use them. Then there are shopping products. These are things that may take more time and more energy and require a greater amount of thought in the purchase. So I think I've asked you all in here before, and I don't think anybody in here actually has anything other than an iPhone. Everybody in here has an iPhone? So when the iPhone first came out, it was really different from every other product in the market. The first sort of smartphones by today's standard and by the iPhone were not very smart. They had very limited features. The cameras were not very good, and they were not the tools of entertainment that we have today. So it was a really radically different way of doing things, and people actually had to think about it and had to learn what we all now know. I mean, when I first got my first iPhone, this was different because I had a BlackBerry before. You had to learn how to expand the screen and contract the screen by doing the pinch thing, and that really is a very innovative way of using and interacting with the device, right? But it takes some amount of learning. It was a high-cost product. Apple is generally a higher priced brand. You can get any kind of sort of Google phone or anything like that for a much less price than you can get the Apple, but most of you have the Apple. Why? Well, because you like the convenience of the features that it offers you, right? The services that it basically provides, the benefits that it provides. So then there's specialty products. These are things that are largely custom made, and it's an artist's painting, and you're really going to have to do a lot of research on these kinds of items. If you want your portrait painted and you want something that's realistic, I wouldn't go to Picasso, because his portraits of people are, very abstract and kind of weird. And if what you're looking for is a realistic impression of yourself, an oil or something like that, you've got to think about the artist that you're going to choose. And then finally, we have unsought products. These are things like funeral services. Almost nobody has a funeral parlor on speed dial. You don't think about this until you need the product, which is when your grandmother dies or your grandfather dies, you think about the product and what you're going to use. And how do you choose that product? It's usually by convenience, like the one that is closest to your house, the one that's in the neighborhood, right? There's not very many. In Guthrie, there's only 2. When I used to ride around Guthrie on my bike as a teenager, there were like 5 funeral homes in Guthrie. Now there's only 2. Why is that? Why is it that there are only 2? Yeah. Okay, you think the population is getting smaller? No. The population of Guthrie, it's not growing exponentially like Edmond, but it is growing. But that's true. I mean, in Oklahoma City, the number of funeral homes has decreased, and the population has certainly not decreased in the United States as a whole. So why is there fewer funeral homes? Let's see, you had your hand up first. Yeah, people die. You're saying people aren't dying? Let's see. Sir, you had your hand up first. That's exactly the correct answer. Yeah. More and more of your generation don't want to spend the money or don't see the value in having a big funeral and spending astronomical amounts of money on a casket and then burying somebody. It's expensive. Funerals are expensive. And so, in fact, we don't even call them funerals. It has been a big change in sorry, I keep moving around because this camera is not working at all today very well. So I'm trying to at least stay in the frame, even though it's very blurry. So people don't see a reason to spend all of that money on the dead anymore, particularly my generation and younger. I had this experience with one of my colleagues. I had a boat at Lake Texoma, and he went down with his wife. He brought his trailer down. We stayed on our boat, and he stayed in his trailer, and we'd go out on Lake Texoma during the day. And I got up in the morning, and I went over to pick them up to come down to the boat, and he wasn't there, and he was getting back shortly after I arrived at their trailer. And I said, "What are you doing, Bob?" He said, "Well, I got to outlive Donna, because if I die first, she thinks she's going to cremate me and not put me in." We've got 2 burial plots in, I can't remember which cemetery. And he's like, "We're going in the ground." And she's like, "I am not going in the ground. I want to be cremated, and I want my ashes, sprinkled." When I was a kid growing up, again, and it's not been, I'm a Gen Xer, people actually went to the cemetery and tended the graves of their loved ones. You go out to a cemetery now, and you see almost nobody going out to the cemetery to put flowers and do all of that on people's graves. So people are getting cremated, and they're scattering their ashes and things like that. That's one of the reasons that the funeral home. And if you're doing that, you need far fewer of them, because people are not having as many services as they once were in that industry. They're doing a small celebration of life rather than having a big church service where everybody comes. And it's kind of depressing if you go to a church service and go to a traditional, what would be called a funeral. It can be really depressing because it's obvious that a lot of times the minister who's speaking doesn't really know this person. Because again, when I was a kid growing up, my family was very strange. We didn't go to church, but Guthrie we have something like 39 churches in Guthrie, and everybody went to church. People are going to church less and less anymore. It was sort of almost a stigma. If you weren't in church on Sunday in Guthrie, people looked at you funny. So it's a big deal, right? That there's been a huge shift. And even the church services that we have, the churches that are growing, are not the traditional necessarily large denominations that were historically large in the past. The Lutheran Church, for example, has lost an enormous number of people, and they're going to non-denominational Protestant churches like Life Church, which provides, I guess, more value for people and more meaning in the postmodern world. And so what we're seeing is a radical shift. What that means is that if you have cremations and you're not doing a lot of services, you don't need as big a building to do that in and have a chapel and all of that. And so it's an industry that is largely shrinking. They're having to come up with new ways of trying to make money. So what's one of the ways and what's one of the innovations that the funeral industry has come up with in order to try and recapture that? You can now we are now capable of manufacturing man-made diamonds, which are chemically exactly the same as natural diamonds. And you can have your loved one turned into a diamond. They will take the remains, the ashes, and they will turn that into a diamond so that you can wear your mother on your neck or your finger or whatever forever and ever. You're like making these faces like that's absolutely crazy, but that's what they're doing because people are not buying caskets anymore. So they're coming up with ways to try and keep that industry alive. So unsought products. Business products. These are purchased by organizations to assist in providing products to others. They're used in the business to come up with ways of providing the products and services that the business needs. So there are a number of ways we can classify these. Components. These are items that become part of the final product. For example, the paint for a car. We used to have a GM facility in Oklahoma City that manufactured cars here, and one of the guys I knew that lived in Guthrie was in charge of the paint shop there. They used thousands of gallons of paint, which was not produced by GM. It was produced by another company that sold to GM the paint that they used for the car. Support products are those that are used to assist in the production. So this would be things like assembly lines. My niece married into this family in Illinois, and they produce assembly line components and assembly lines themselves. And they produce them for Boeing and other large corporations. So we're talking about massive kind of like conveyor belt types of steel products that will move products along a floor. The printers that we can now use to come up with things, the 3D printing, are things like support products. Installation are things like construction, building, trades, equipment. Accessory equipment are those things that you need for the office, tools. The monitors that we use here in the College of Business, obviously, are accessory products. And then supplies. If you have a building with lots of people, you have to have a bathroom. You got to keep things like toilet supplies, soap, towels, things like that. And then industrial services or repair, maintenance, legal, accounting, and auditing services are all important. And the way we market those is very dependent upon the size of the organization and a lot of changes. With regard to legal and accounting and auditing, those rules change. The tax code changes frequently. There are some major changes that came out this year in the tax code. And so you have to keep up with that and come up with new ways of keeping your clients satisfied. We can talk about companies and how diversified they are in terms of their products line, and product mix. So a product is a specific, unique unit that they sell. These are referred to as SKUs, stock keeping units. The average Walmart until recently had something like 250,000 SKUs in a Walmart supercenter. That's incredible. 250,000 individual items. A product line is things that are closely related. So if you go to Walmart and you go through the dental hygiene aisle, they've got toothpaste, mouthwash, toothbrushes, water picks, right? Those are all things that are closely related. Oftentimes they are manufactured by the same company, but not necessarily, right? Water pick is different than Colgate, which manufactures toothpaste. And then product mix is all the product lines offered by an organization. So for example, 3M. 3M is famous for producing things that are adhesives for a lot of industries. They have a program where their scientists can engage in a certain percentage of their time on novel or experimental research ideas. And one of the products that one guy came up with, and it became kind of a punchline in a movie now that's rather old called Romy and Michelle's High School Reunion. Have any of you seen that? It's an old show at this point, but they decide that they're going to tell everybody so that they appear more successful that they developed Post-its, and that was invented by 3M. So they had a scientist who came up with an adhesive that was not terribly sticky. But what it would do is it would stick enough one piece of paper to another, but you could then remove it without tearing the paper. And so what was going to be a failure actually ended up being sort of a marketing success, because how many of us all use Post-its? A lot. We use them in all kinds of things. And they come up with all kinds of product SKUs as a result of that line. So for example, one of the things that they came out with along with Post-its was not just Post-its that were yellow and one size, but all different kinds of sizes. And I see people who have all kinds of Post-its all over their computer monitor for things that they need to remember to do that day, tasks that they've got. They have Post-its that are basically tabs that allow you to mark things in your books or where we're going to sign. Lawyers use a lot of these to show their clients where they need to sign in contracts. And if you close on a house, they'll have literally, 30 or 40 of those on those documents that you're going to sign your life away. So the product mix is all the different lines. What else does 3M make? Well, it's not just Post-its. It's not just that adhesive. They also make things for dental appliances. So when I got my braces on many years ago, in the mid-1980s, it was a long process. You went to an orthodontist and they had to apply each bracket individually, and they still do. They still have to apply each bracket individually to your teeth. But the way they did it was they had to apply it with a cement, and it took a long time for it to harden. So they would put the bracket on with the cement, and then they would have to hold it there in place and kind of wait and keep the tooth dry by using a suction device and swabs while the bracket dried. 3M came up with an adhesive that would dry almost instantly with light cure. Using ultraviolet light, they could cure it and bond it to the tooth almost instantly. And that was a huge radical transformation in the orthodontic industry, because it allowed orthodontists to be able to do far more patients in a day if you're not having to sit there and really wait than they had before. So they do dental adhesives, they do Post-it adhesives. They also come up with adhesives for all kinds of other industries out there. So the product mix is all the product lines that are offered by the organization. When we talk about newness and we think about coming up with new products, we have to think about what is really new. What makes something new? So I have the iPhone. I've got to look again to make sure. And I think I've talked about this before in here, but redundancy is a good thing. So I have the iPhone 14 Pro Max. What's the latest version of the iPhone? Is it 17? 17. So I am 3 models behind the latest model. Is there a tremendous difference between the 17 and the 14? No, not really. Probably the biggest difference is the charger. Yeah. Because the European Union mandated that everybody was going to go to a standardized thing, Apple did this thing that was great, which was they had all proprietary stuff. It was great for them, maybe not great for the consumer, but they had all proprietary stuff. So what did Apple have for they had a proprietary, patented, designed charger called a lightning cable. And for those of you who have these, how many of you still have the old charger, the lightning cable chargers, right? It was fantastic. It charged really quickly, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But the European Union started saying, we're not going to let you do that because we want everybody to sort of have a standardized thing. And so they've mandated largely, as I understand it, that everybody's going to have to use the USB-C. And so almost all, that's the big difference between the 14 and the 17 that I can tell. There's some parts of the facial recognition that are supposed to be faster. As I understand it, the cameras have gotten a little bit better, but overall, can you tell a difference? Not really. Really? I can't believe that because they couldn't sell it in Europe. I mean, but, okay. Well, Apple would like that because one of the problems is that if everybody has the USB-C, what does it allow you to do? It allows you to use your friends, when you're over at their house or whatever, without having to run out. I can't tell you. So I have these friends who just insist. He works in technology, and so he insists that the Android phones are far superior to the iPhone, and I insist that he's wrong. But I can't tell you how many times I've gone and spent the night at their house and forgotten my cable, and I'm running to the convenience store to buy a lightning cable because they have these Android phones that never have the same charger. So it's a way of making money for Apple in terms of selling more product if they have a specific unit. So I'm sure Apple would like to do that. I'm not sure that they'll actually go ahead with it because it means that you're going to have to manufacture two separate lines, one, I believe, for Europe, which is going to standardize everything, and then one for the United States. So we can talk about relative with relation to the newness of the current product. Is the 17 or 18 going to be that much different than this one? Not really. There were huge leaps. If you went back and looked at the first iPhones, there are huge differences between those first iPhones and this one in terms of the quality of the camera and the pictures and things like that it took. But there's just not that much difference between the 14 and the 15 or the 16 or the 17. It has become incremental changes, right? So is it really all that new? Is it revolutionary versus a modification in the way we already do things? So the first smartphone was invented in 1994, and it was called the Simon Personal Communicator. It was made by IBM, and if you look at it, it looks nothing like a smartphone today because it had big clunky buttons. It was huge. It didn't do that much in terms of the functionality that we've now got. It was radically different. The iPhone was radically different than what came before. But since that time, and from the first iPhone to the second and the third, there was a lot of changes that they made to the device that made it better. They got smaller, they got thinner, the glass got better in terms of not being so easily broken. The first iPhones, you could drop them and the cases would crack and shatter. And so you had to really be careful, which is now everybody puts a screen protector on there, but you can drop them and they're pretty kind of hardy devices now. The camera lenses, if you dropped one of the early ones, that would have shattered and gone the way of the Dodo, and you would have had problems. But in the last few series, I'm not sure that there's been that much of a radical transformation. We can talk about newness from the consumer's perspective. What is the degree of learning required by the consumer? Is it continuous innovation, which is changes in features? So Apple releases new updates on their iPhone, and they now force it. It used to be, again, when the first iPhones came out, you could decide that you didn't want to change because you had learned how to do something the way it was that you liked and that you had gotten used to, and you could avoid the updates. You can no longer do that. The phone will update, right? Or if you get beyond a certain point, the functionality just becomes kind of wonky and it kind of forces you to update. This is a huge issue. Particularly, I have older people in my family that I help take care of and look after, and they have just given up. I mean, my aunt was one of the first people to get a cell phone years and years and years ago. But it was not that big of a difference between learning to use a cell phone and the phone that you had in your house. You dialed. The only difference was that it didn't automatically, when you took the phone out of the bag, there were bag phones. When you took the phone out of the bag, it didn't automatically, when you lifted it out of the cradle, it didn't automatically give you a ringtone on it. You had to actually hit another button to get it to send. And so that was a minor change in learning that you had to go about. But this really was a radical transformation when it was released in terms of the newness and the learning curve that was required by consumers. Is it dynamically continuous where you have minor changes in behavior? Generally speaking, the updates that Apple forces on you are oftentimes minor that don't require, and you may not even notice it. I think the last update that I did, though, it really did radically change. It really reorganized, for example, the way the phone book looks and the way and where voicemail is and how you get to your voicemail, which was really annoying. When Microsoft Office decided to redo the way they had organized emails forever and ever, which was you started at the top and that was the newest, and the bottom was the oldest, and they at one point in time flipped it. And you could flip it back, but it was radically annoying, right? To have to then scroll up through everything, because everybody was used to, if you needed to see what was said in a previous thread, scrolling down. Discontinuous innovation requires high levels of learning. The example that I give here is, so since I'm an attorney, one of the things that I studied, and I used to teach criminal law and procedure here at UCO many years ago. And I remember teaching that class when police body cameras came out. And all of a sudden, I mean, it was both a blessing and a curse for the officer, because it could provide absolute, really good proof that you were justified in taking the actions against a suspect that you took with regard to the seizure of that individual, right? So for Fourth Amendment purposes, we don't really talk about arrest. We talk about seizure. And what is a seizure? A seizure is any time you're not free to go. So if you want some free legal information, I can't provide you legal advice because that would create an attorney-client privilege. But having taught criminal law and procedure, when you are talking with the officer, you need to, first of all, ask, am I free to go? And if you're not, then you need to say, I want to speak to my lawyer, right? You are seized at that point for the purposes of Fourth Amendment protections, right? So now there are different ways we can seize you. How can we seize you? Well, we can do a traffic stop, right? And just pull you over, and you are sort of, pulling over to the side of the road. And if the officer tells you you're not free to go, you are seized for Fourth Amendment purposes, all the way up to including, very strong uses of force like tasing, pepper spray, or even the use of a firearm, right, to seize somebody. So generally speaking, like the more severe the seizure is, the more scrutiny there's going to be on police officers. And forever and ever and ever, people really, and juries particularly, took the words of officers. But once they had body cams, a lot of it began to change. And it disrupted a lot of fields of law like DUI, because juries would look at kind of videos of somebody and say, yeah, I don't think they were drunk, right? So it changed a lot in terms of the way we had to go about training or engaging in policing. There is a legal definition that the FTC uses. They say it is from 6 months of regular distribution. Now, this becomes very squishy, because what is regular distribution? Oftentimes, products are released in test markets, and they may be released in big scales in these test markets, but is that regular distribution? When Burger King, so I watched a documentary on the fast food wars. Ray Kroc meets these two brothers. He's a salesman of milkshake machines, and he's not terribly successful at that. But he has this one client that really needs a lot. So he sells these milkshake makers that come in a 3-headed shaker, right? So you could put 3 cups. And nobody, if you went to the drugstore, nobody really thought that was all that beneficial because they weren't making tons of milkshakes. But McDonald's comes up with a way of serving people very quickly, these two brothers, very limited menu. You could get burger, fries, Coke, shake, basically, right? Was their early menu. And they needed to be able to produce milkshakes a lot faster because you can't just, it takes quite a bit of time to make one milkshake if you've just got one machine. So these 3, so they were buying. He looks at their model and he actually then, decides he can franchise this, and he takes it. And, if you watch the movie The Founder, they don't portray him as being such a wonderful guy, but he did take McDonald's to the next level in terms of its ability to really scale the idea that these two brothers had and mass market it. Well, after he becomes pretty successful and he's got a lot of stores out there, other people start to enter the market, right? One of these is Burger King. And Burger King's burgers, because McDonald's burgers were cooked on a grill, they were smaller. They didn't have lettuce. I think they had ketchup, onion, pickle, lettuce, and they had this device that they'd kind of invented that would squeeze out a drop or 2 of lettuce and mustard. They'd put a pickle and some reconstituted dehydrated onions on this hamburger and send it out the door. And it's really, it's fast, it's efficient, it's cheap. Burger King comes along and they come up with a way of producing a better burger while still being pretty fast at this process, right? So it starts to challenge McDonald's. And they decide that they've got to innovate. So what do? They went from being extremely top heavy in terms of their mandating what their franchisees could do to allowing for some experimentation among the franchisees. And so they started letting them come up with new and novel ideas. And one of the ones that they came up with was a fish sandwich. And the most famous, probably, that was invented by one of their franchisees is the Big Mac. So that was going to compete with Burger King's the Whopper. So instead of just one meat patty, now you had 2 all beef patties, special sauce, lettuce, cheese, pickles, onions on a sesame seed bun. And that was the innovation that they came up with. Now it starts out at just this one franchisee, and then they expand the market. So what is newness, if we're going to say new, when we talk about regular distribution? Well, that's somewhat subjective. From an organizational perspective, we can think about it in terms of 3 levels. Is it an extension, which is low risk? Apple coming up with the new version of the iPhone every 1.5 to 2 years is pretty low risk. They know that they've got a built-in market. If you'll give me your ducks, I will go ahead and give you credit.
Thank you.
It's pretty low risk at this point. They know that there's a lot of people out there that like the iPhone. Again, I'll ask, is there anybody in here who doesn't have an iPhone? Everybody in here has an iPhone. So this is pretty low risk. And eventually you'll want the newer model, if for no other reason than what starts to happen to your iPhone. It's happening to my 14 at this point because I've had it for, 4 years or 5 years now. It's starting to slow down. The battery needs to be changed. And am I going to spend a couple $100 on a new battery when I could just go get a new phone and put that money towards the latest and greatest, whatever it is that they've come up with that they think is better than the 14? Well, probably I'm going to go get the new phone. So it's just an extension. That's not really all that. And this is, Apple deliberately does engage in cannibalization of their products, knowing that you're going to do this. Now, it's a delicate dance because the automobile manufacturers did this in the 1980s, and as a result, they really lost quality control. One of the things the American automobile manufacturers did is they were much better at innovative design than things like Mercedes-Benz in the 1980s. You could not tell a difference in a Mercedes-Benz from the 1970s to the 1980s. They all sort of look the same. Now, for some people, that was a big selling point, which was nobody was going to be able to tell that you had an older car if you drove at that point in time a Mercedes-Benz, because they looked the same pretty much from year to year with very minor changes. They didn't do radical transformations. The American automobile manufacturers were making much more radical transformations in their car designs over shorter periods of time, and it really, I think, led to some quality control issues. So is there significant innovation going on, which was when we went from the first 1994 smartphone to the iPhone? That's a major significant innovation in the development of that product line. Or is it a brand extension? So Google comes out with a phone so that you can use their product. What has Google primarily been up until the point that they started releasing phones? They were an internet service provider and search engine that collected massive amounts of data on you so that it could resell that data. Why do most products fail? And what makes a product successful? And again, I talked about New Coke earlier. What was it that made New Coke a failure? By all outward objective, everything that Coca-Cola did, they did right in terms of bringing this product to market. They looked at this research that Pepsi had done, that people liked the sweeter taste, and they decided they were going to launch this product. And it was a miserable failure because people had a lot of nostalgia about Coca-Cola. And if you think about the ads from that time period, Coke had these just fantastic, particularly at Christmas time, these great ads with, people singing in the shape of a Christmas tree, holding candles on a hill. I'd like to teach the world to sing. I'd like to buy the world a Coke. And it was a catchy little thing. And people had this sort of fond memories of Coca-Cola, and all of a sudden it wasn't what they remembered from their childhood. And that's probably one of the reasons it was a big failure. So even if you do everything right, you can still have a failure. What do you need to do to make sure that you have less chance of failure? Well, you need to have a well-defined target market. You need to know what's out there, what the consumers want. You have to know what their preferences are. This means that you really need to engage in market research. And then you have to know how your product will differentiate itself and satisfy the wants and preferences of that target market. And you have to know approximately what the size of that target market is. Rolex has innovated some of its designs recently. They've made changes to their watches in terms of the sizes and sort of the chunkiness of the design. But the market for a Rolex is pretty small. If you want to buy a new presidential Rolex, they're starting at $75,000 and more. Not a lot of market there. Not a lot of people who can afford that compared to the market for a Timex, right? So why do products fail? There is an insignificant point of difference. So far, Apple has been able to convince us that we need to buy the newest thing. But at some point in time, the cannibalization, I think, will become, the points of difference will be so insignificant that we won't really want. I mean, it's one of the reasons that I have held on to this 14, because I can't really tell a big difference. I traded models much more frequently during the early years of the Apple iPhone because there were radical differences in terms of the quality of the things you were able to do on this device from the first model of iPhone to, going through like 6 or 7. After that point, it became incrementally different. And so I might wait 2 models, and then there would be some big transformation in every 2 or 3 models, and I would change phones. But there's not a significant point of difference at some point in time. Is there a big difference again between the 14 and the 17? I don't know that there is enough to make a difference in the way I am going to conduct my life. Obviously, there was a big difference in the early stages in terms of what you could do. I'm a marketer, so obviously I like things like social media marketing in terms of what you could do with posting really great quality photos. The photo quality that you can take on this phone is incredible compared to, what used to require a fairly large camera and very stable conditions. That has become, really, really different. You don't have economic access to buyers. Many consumer packaged goods fail because they don't have access to buyers. They are not able to get their product in front of the public. There's a great barbecue company here in Oklahoma. Anybody know what it is? It's from Ponca City. What? You got your hand up. Huh? Swadley. I was thinking about the one who makes the sauce for sale. Swadley's is a good barbecue. I will give you that. Good barbecue restaurant. But what's the barbecue sauce maker? They're from Ponca City. It's called Head Country. And I think it is really some of the best barbecue sauce. Now, everybody has differences of opinion. There's a difference between Kansas City barbecue and Head Country. There's a difference between KC Masterpiece. Most of those differences come in whether or not it's got a more sweet or sour kind of flavor to the barbecue, right? And so whether it's more vinegary or it's got more sugar in it, those kinds of things make a difference. So Head Country was very fortunate in that it used to be that Walmart store managers had a limited ability to stock and source products from a local market if they wanted to. Now, generally, those companies had to prove their marketability because every ounce of space in a grocery store is accounted for. And if you're taking up space on a shelf and you're not selling, the grocery store is not going to carry you because you're taking up valuable space that could be taken up by somebody else. Head Country actually managed to get into Walmart. You can no longer do this, as I understand it. You have to go through Bentonville now. They do not allow local store managers the ability to source local products. All of those have to go through Bentonville. What does that mean? It means that things like Head Country, which got into Walmart and have managed to get into Sam's Club and are sold. And I remember when I was getting my PhD in New Mexico, in southern New Mexico, I literally almost broke down and cried the first time I saw Head Country stocked on the shelves in the Las Cruces Walmart, because barbecue is not a big thing in southern New Mexico, right? Mexican food is a big thing in southern New Mexico, not barbecue. And so they had all this really crappy barbecue that people down there would accept, the KC Masterpieces, which I didn't think was very good. And I literally was just overcome by excitement that they were carrying Head Country, which was from Oklahoma, which I thought was like the best barbecue. And they also have a seasoning that goes along with that. Now, the seasoning I've noticed has not been stocked on the shelves for a while in Walmart, but their barbecue sauce is, because it's still really very successful in terms of its product to sell. But a lot of people now, if there's a barrier to entry, like you have to go to Bentonville, have a problem with that because they don't have the access and the ability to go spend time and have an office in Bentonville so that they can get a meeting with a buyer there. The incomplete protocol. I witnessed this when a friend of mine and I, we were doing product testing for companies, and one of the product companies that we did testing for was Sonic, and the CEO of Sonic at the time was Cliff Hudson, and he would come up with just crazy ideas that weren't tested and decide that that was what they were going to try. Sonic is really very limited in the amount of innovation that they can do because they're constrained by the size of their space. They're a very limited space, and so almost everything in a Sonic has to be combinations of stuff that they already have, or if they want to add something to their menu that's radically different, they have to figure out how they're going to fit it in the space of that very small kitchen area that they have for their restaurants. A lack of satisfaction on critical factors, that can be a difference. What is a critical factor? Well, what does the consumer really value? And if you're not meeting those critical values, what is it that we really value about the iPhone? Well, it's become for a lot of us almost our entire lives. I no longer really, I have a desktop at home and I have a laptop, but I answer probably 95% or more of my emails on my phone. I no longer, now, is that the most convenient way of doing it? No. Does it take longer than if I had a full keyboard and could type really quickly? Probably, but I can do it anywhere. I can do it, at a restaurant. While I'm sitting there ordering food, waiting, I can answer emails and do things like that. So lack of satisfaction of critical factors. What is it that makes this really unique and successful? It has allowed us to replace a lot of other devices that were cumbersome and heavy with this one thing. Your schedule is probably on this device. What you have to do is probably on this device. Bad timing. If you released a new product during COVID, it probably failed because particularly, let's say you were a restaurant chain that happened to open a new line of restaurant at the beginning of COVID when everything shut down. People weren't going to restaurants because the pandemic had everything closed, right? So that would be bad timing. Not any fault of your own. You could come up with a really great concept and it's just poor timing. Poor quality. I think Microsoft is famous for doing this. They release, and you all are too young to remember this, but they released a product that they said was just going to be radically better than other versions of Windows, and it was called Vista, and it was horrible. It was an absolute, complete, and utter disaster. Microsoft is famous for releasing kind of crappy product updates and then fixing them on the back end, which is not exactly the way we would tell you to do it, but they're so large, they're the largest, producer of computer software platforms that they can get away with it. A lack of market attractiveness, so the market is just too small. The fact that you like something doesn't mean that everybody else will. And then poor execution of the marketing mix. You can have a really great product, it can be really well made, it can have a lack, or it can have a significant point of differentiation between other products. But if you don't have access to all of the elements of the marketing mix, the logistics, which is supply chain, the ability to engage in IMC and advertising and promotion, you're going to have a problem. So the poor execution of the marketing mix. So steps in the product development process. There are 7 steps. So you have to define the role for the product and how it will fit with overall objectives. You have to combine your strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, and threats, and an environmental scan. So you have to take 2 steps. What are our strengths, weaknesses? What are the external factors, the opportunities and threats? And you have to combine that with an environmental scan of how large is the market? What is it that we can do to attract the market? Things like that. Where do you get a pool of ideas for this? Oftentimes, employees. And I mentioned Post-its with 3M. So employees develop that. That was an employee-developed product. A lot of times your employees, your sales force are critical components, and they're out there talking to consumers and asking them what they want. So customers and suppliers, you can use your sales force to listen to them. And then formal research and development labs. Obviously, when we have a pandemic, the pharmaceutical industry responds to that and they know what they need to do. It's a matter of getting into the lab and coming up with methods of isolating, viruses and things like that, and figuring out what will work to either cure or prevent. So screening and evaluation, you have to consider your technical feasibility. When I was in industry, the company I worked for developed learning management systems for the K-12 market. And we were the smallest of the large software publishers. We were not sexy. We had a really good backbone, but we couldn't deliver the really slick kind of interfaces that Plato and Riverdeep were developing because we lacked the technical feasibility to do that. We didn't have the number of programmers that it would have taken to do that. You have to rely on external factors, testing ideas on consumers in very systematic ways. Develop detailed step 4 financial projections and assess your market. This is tough and it can be difficult to do when you develop your marketing plan. Then develop a prototype. Can you test it in a lab, or do you have to use consumer testing? Some things are really hard to test in a lab. How do you test an idea like a museum? Alice Walton built this incredible museum complex in Arkansas, and how do you test that before you release it? It's really hard to do. Now, it helps that it was a pet project of hers, and I don't think she ever intended for it to make money. It's just about, but it's become a major tourist attraction in Northwest Arkansas. So what kinds of testing are available? Can you do standard market tests through normal distribution or controlled tests of the market or simulated marketing tests? There used to be a company in Quail Springs Mall that did these where they would ask people to try, and I was in the mall one day and they asked me to try ice cream flavors that they were coming up with. And so I got to test a whole lot of ice cream that day. And again, sometimes these tests don't work because you can't test out how you're going to develop a brand new museum or an entire school or something like that. Then you have to position your product in the market, create an idea in the mind of the consumers, and decide whether or not you're going to go with a smaller scale launch or a full scale launch in step 7. All right, so on Thursday, you guys are going to meet in your groups. You're going to, I will put the prompt, I will release it today for you so that you can start working on it early to get that idea of how Loves can maximize their marketability of this new emerging market in automobiles, which is the electric car. Electric cars and electric vehicles were really, really hot. I've seen in the last year or so, particularly as a result of the fact that one of the things you might consider, for example, in these, and thinking about this, is what made them so attractive to so many people? Tax credits. The tax credits went away, and the sales of electric cars as a result have decreased, right? So you might think about that in your research. Any questions? All right, if you got ducks, come and see me.